Okay, so we're diving deep today into a book that's clearly making waves, James Clear's Atomic Habits. And you, our listeners, sent in a really fascinating mix of stuff, video reviews, written analyses.
Yeah.
And I think our goal today is to kind of get past just the surface level popularity of this thing
Right.
and really dig into the core principles here,
Yeah.
see what makes this book tick, and maybe even poke around at, some of the more nuanced perspectives.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've given us a great place to start. And I think what we want to do is sort of unpack those core ideas for everybody listening, see where those might have the most impact.
Yeah.
And then maybe even touch on some of the questions that were raised in some of the material that you sent.
Yeah. Okay. So right off the bat, the central idea of Atomic Habits is this small incremental improvements in our habits
Right.
can lead to surprisingly significant results over time. It's the power of compounding,
Absolutely.
right? Think of it like, planting a tiny seed that eventually grows into a mighty oak tree.
Yeah.
Or it's that concept of 1% better every day.
Yeah, that 1% might seem insignificant in the moment.
Right.
But as we go along, you'll see how those marginal gains can really accumulate and lead to some pretty transformative change.
Yeah.
It's not about overnight success. It's about consistent progress.
Now, the book itself is structured around this really practical framework, the 4 laws of behavior change,
Right.
which are essentially the ground rules for building good habits and breaking bad ones.
Yes.
And it's really about making good habits obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying.
Yeah.
And then, of course, flipping those principles when you're trying to ditch the unwanted habits.
Right. It's a very action-oriented structure. And by going through each of these 4 laws, I think Clear gives us a lot of really usable strategies that you can actually apply in your own life.
Yeah. And clearly a message that resonates. I mean, the book has reportedly sold over 10 to 15 million copies.
Wow.
That's huge. It says something about how many people out there are looking for some practical guidance on improving their lives.
It taps into that sort of universal desire for growth and self-improvement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this idea that you don't need these massive sweeping changes, but rather these small manageable steps is very appealing.
Before we even get into the 4 laws, Clear also lays the groundwork by talking about different levels of change.
Right.
So you've got outcome change, which are the results that you're after.
Right.
You've got process change, which are the systems that you put in place to get there.
Right.
But then he argues that the most profound and lasting change happens at the level of identity, really focusing on who you want to become.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
It's not just about achieving a goal like running a marathon. It's about seeing yourself as a runner.
Right.
And I think Clear really makes the case that that shift in self-perception is what makes those long-term habits stick.
Yeah.
If your habits are at odds with how you see yourself, maintaining those is an uphill battle.
Okay, let's get into the meat of it. This idea of the power of small atomic habits. When Clear uses the word atomic, what's he getting at?
I think you can think of atomic in this context as the smallest possible unit of something, something fundamental, something foundational.
Yeah.
So for Clear, that represents those tiny actions, those marginal gains, that 1% improvement that we mentioned.
Yeah.
It's about shifting your focus from trying to make these massive leaps to concentrating on these incredibly small, almost imperceptible actions.
And that's where that crazy compounding effect kicks in, right?
It does.
One of the video reviews you sent actually did the math and showed that if you improve by just 1% each day, you end up being something like 37 times better after a year.
Wow.
That sounds almost too good to be true, but the numbers don't lie.
It highlights this exponential power of consistency.
Mm-hmm.
And those small daily improvements, they build on each other. They create a snowball effect. And of course, the flip side of that is also true.
Oh, yeah.
Negative habits, they compound over time, too.
Right.
And they subtly drag you in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Clear uses this analogy of comparing habits to the compound interest of self-improvement.
I love that one.
Which is fantastic, right? It helps to make that kind of abstract concept feel much more real and understandable.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's important to remember, as Clear points out, often you won't see any visible difference from these small habits initially.
Right.
You might be consistently working on a new habit for weeks or even months without noticing any significant change. But then all of a sudden you cross this critical threshold and suddenly the results become undeniable.
It's like that classic example of the boiling water.
Yes.
Right. For a long time, nothing seems to happen. And then suddenly at 100 degrees Celsius,
Boom!
it boils.
Yeah.
All that incremental heat finally reaches a tipping point.
Absolutely. I think it requires patience
Yeah.
and, as you said, trust in the process, even when you don't see immediate returns.
Now, one central argument in the book that I really loved is this idea of shifting our focus away from just setting these big, lofty goals
Right.
and instead concentrating on building these effective systems.
Yeah.
Why does Clear argue against solely focusing on goals?
So Clear makes a really compelling point here. He points out that often winners and losers have the exact same goals.
Interesting.
So think about athletes. Every competitor in a race wants to win the race.
Right.
The goal itself isn't the differentiating factor.
It's the training.
It's the training regimen. The daily practice is a system that separates them.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to look at it. Everyone wants to achieve great things, but it's really about the path.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He also argues that achieving a goal is often just a temporary fix.
Oh, that's interesting.
Once you reach it, what happens then?
Yeah.
If you haven't established a sustainable system, you might very easily revert to your old habits. He even goes on to say that this overemphasis on goals can actually limit our happiness
Interesting.
because we're constantly in a state of not yet there.
I see. Yeah.
And finally, he argues that goals can sometimes be at odds with long-term progress if we become too fixated on the endpoint and neglect those daily actions that will actually get us there.
It's about learning to enjoy the journey, right? Finding satisfaction in the daily practices rather than just fixating on the finish line.
I think that's a great way to put it. Clear emphasizes that our commitment to the process, those daily habits, those routines,
Right.
that's what ultimately determines our long-term progress. We can't control the outcome perfectly,
Yeah.
but we absolutely can control the systems that we put in place.
That brings us to the core of the book, The 4 Laws of Behavior Change.
Yes.
Let's dive into that first one. Make it obvious, the cue. What's the fundamental idea behind this first law?
I think the first law is all about awareness.
Okay.
You can't change a habit if you're not even aware that it exists or what triggers it.
Right.
So making the cues for good habits visible in our environment is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
So think about it. If you want to exercise more, leaving your workout clothes out in plain sight
Yeah.
can act as a visual prompt. Or if you want to drink more water,
Yeah.
keeping a water bottle on your desk,
Right.
just it makes it that much more obvious a choice.
That's where habit stacking comes in?
Yes.
Which sounds like a really ingenious technique
Yeah.
for building new habits. How does that work?
So habit stacking is a strategy where you attach a new habit that you want to form
Okay.
to an existing habit that you already do regularly. The formula is really simple. After current habit, I will new habit.
Right.
So, for example, one of the reviews you shared talked about if you consistently make a cup of coffee in the morning,
Yeah.
you could stack a new habit onto that.
Mm-hmm.
After I pour my coffee, I will spend 1 minute meditating.
Right.
So the existing habit acts as a trigger
I see.
or a reminder for the new one.
It's like you're creating a mental domino effect where one established action leads to the next desired one.
Precisely.
Yeah.
One action serves as a cue for the next.
Uh-huh.
And Clear also highlights the powerful role of our environment in shaping our habits
Mm-hmm.
by making the cues for bad habits invisible. For instance, by removing junk food from your pantry.
Right.
And at the same time, making the cues for good habits more prominent.
Right.
We can significantly influence our behavior.
I love that idea of one space, one use.
Yes.
Can you explain that one?
Yeah, so the idea there is to create these distinct associations between different environments
Yeah.
and specific activities.
Yeah.
So your bedroom should primarily be for sleep, your home office is for work, and so on.
Right.
This helps minimize conflicting cues within a single space. So if you try to work from your bed, for example,
Yeah.
the cues associated with relaxation and sleep are going to make it a lot harder to focus.
That makes sense.
So by creating these dedicated spaces, you make it a lot more clear what behavior is expected in that particular environment.
Yeah.
And Clear also emphasizes the importance of being really specific about when and where you'll perform a new habit.
Oh, okay.
And this level of intentionality, I think, dramatically increases the likelihood that you'll actually follow through.
Okay. Moving on to the second law. Make it attractive, the craving. How do we actually make those good habits something we genuinely want to do?
So this law really dives into the motivational aspect of habit formation. And Clear explains that it's the anticipation of a reward, the craving,
Yeah.
that drives us to act, often even more so than the experience of the reward itself.
Interesting.
So the key here is to link good habits with things you already enjoy.
This sounds like that idea of temptation bundling or habit bundling
Yes.
that a few of the reviews talked about. How does that work in practice?
Yeah, so temptation bundling or habit bundling involves pairing a habit that you need to do
Mm-hmm.
with a habit that you genuinely want to do.
Okay.
So, for example, you might only allow yourself to listen to your favorite podcast while you're at the gym.
Right.
Or as one review said, you could create a rule that says you can only check social media after you've completed a certain amount of work.
Yeah.
So it's leveraging that desire for the enjoyable activity
Yeah.
to motivate you to do the necessary one.
That's really clever.
Yeah.
It's like hacking your own motivation system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By making that good habit the gateway to something you already enjoy,
Yeah.
you increase its attractiveness. And Clear also highlights the significant influence of social norms.
Okay.
We're far more likely to adopt habits that are common and accepted within our social groups.
Makes sense.
So consciously joining communities or surrounding yourself with people who already exhibit the behaviors that you desire
Yeah.
can make those habits more attractive and easier to adopt.
Yeah. It's much easier to stick to a healthy eating plan if you're surrounded by friends who also value and practice healthy eating.
Exactly.
All right, let's tackle the third law. Make it easy, the response. This
Yeah.
one seems fairly self-explanatory.
Right. The core principle here is to reduce friction associated with good habits
Yeah.
and increase the friction for bad habits. And Clear introduces a 2-minute rule under this law.
Tell me about the 2-minute rule.
So the 2-minute rule basically suggests scaling down any new habit that you want to adopt
Okay.
to something that takes less than 2 minutes to complete. So if your goal is to start exercising regularly, your 2-minute version might simply be putting on your workout clothes.
Okay.
If you want to read more, it might be just committing to reading one page.
Right.
The idea is to make that initial step so easy
Yeah.
that there's virtually no resistance to starting. And once you've begun, it's a lot easier to continue the habit for longer.
It's all about lowering that barrier to entry, making it effortless to get started.
Exactly. And Clear also emphasizes the importance of designing your environment to make those good habits the default choice and make bad habits more inconvenient.
Mm.
So if you want to eat healthier,
Right.
keep fresh fruits and vegetables readily available.
Yeah.
And remove those processed snacks from your house.
Yeah.
The less effort a good habit requires, the more likely you are to do it consistently.
Okay, and finally, we arrive at the fourth law. Make it satisfying the reward. How do we ensure that our good habits actually feel rewarding enough to make them stick in the long run?
I think this law underscores the critical role of immediate reinforcement.
Okay.
While the long-term benefits of good habits are undoubtedly significant,
Yeah.
it's those immediate rewards
Yeah.
that give us the motivation to repeat the behavior in the short term.
Right.
One of the reviews you sent talked about creating a visual reward system,
Mm.
like putting $1 in a jar every time you stick to a healthy eating goal.
Yeah.
And that sense of accomplishment
Yeah.
can be really powerful.
That instant gratification can be a strong motivator.
It really is.
Yeah.
And Clear also highlights habit tracking as a really effective tool for making habits more satisfying.
Mm.
Simply seeing yourself make progress, marking off days, or checking boxes on a tracker,
Right.
it can be a really strong motivator in itself.
It's so satisfying just like ticking those boxes.
It is.
Yeah.
It provides visual evidence of your efforts and reinforces the desired behavior.
And that don't break the chain mentality that often develops with those habit trackers
Yes,
seems to be a really key element there.
absolutely. It creates a sense of accountability and encourages consistency.
Mhm.
And I think that visual representation of your streak becomes something you don't want to lose.
We touched on this earlier, but let's revisit this idea of the role of identity. How does that deeper level of change connect with Clear's framework for building these lasting habits?
So Clear states that true long-lasting habit change comes from a fundamental shift in our identity.
Okay.
And that means focusing on who we want to become rather than solely on what we want to achieve.
Interesting.
He argues that our habits are, in essence, how we embody our identity.
Yeah.
Every action we take is a vote for the kind of person we see ourselves as.
So it's not just about doing the actions, it's about aligning those actions with your core values and your desired self-image.
Exactly. If your behavior is incongruent with your self-identity, it's very unlikely to be sustainable.
I see.
So, for example, someone who genuinely identifies as a writer will be far more likely to consistently write, even when they don't feel particularly motivated.
Yeah.
The act of writing reinforces their identity,
Yeah.
and that identity, in turn, reinforces that habit of writing.
It becomes this like positive feedback loop
Exactly.
where your actions and your sense of self are kind of mutually reinforcing each other.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Improvements are often temporary until they become part of who you are.
I like that.
It's about believing in that identity and letting your habits be the evidence of that belief.
Now, while Atomic Habits has clearly resonated with a ton of people, it's not without its nuances and even some criticisms. What are some of the different perspectives or maybe the potential limitations that have been raised in the stuff you shared?
Well, there were several interesting points of nuance and criticism that came up in the materials you provided. One perspective was that the book might oversimplify what is often a very complex process of habit formation.
Okay.
So, for example, one reviewer questioned how well the 1% better everyday idea holds up
Mm-hmm.
when you're dealing with highly complex skills or fields
Hmm.
where progress isn't always linear or easily quantifiable.
Right. Sometimes it's not a smooth upward curve.
Right. Another critique that emerged was that the book can feel somewhat repetitive in places,
Okay.
and that some of the examples used, while very relatable,
Yeah.
might be based more on anecdotes than on rigorous scientific research.
Interesting.
One reviewer even mentioned being a little surprised by the reliance on certain internet sources.
Okay.
There's also the concern that the book might be applying the same fundamental principles to a very wide range of behaviors,
Yeah.
from simple lifestyle adjustments to more deeply ingrained compulsive habits, without fully acknowledging the potential differences in their underlying causes
Right.
and the strategies that might be required to address them.
Yeah, it's almost like suggesting the same exercise routine for both a casual walker and a professional athlete.
Exactly.
One of the reviews you sent mentioned finding the frequent directions to the author's website, a
Yeah.
little bit disruptive to the reading experience. And then finally, while many acknowledge that the core ideas presented in Atomic Habits aren't necessarily revolutionary in and of themselves,
Yeah.
I think the book's real strength lies in its ability to synthesize and organize these concepts into a very clear, accessible, and actionable framework. However, for someone who has already encountered a lot of these principles elsewhere,
There might not be a ton of really groundbreaking new information.
so it's more about the packaging and presentation of well-established ideas.
Precisely. It's a well-structured system, but it might not necessarily delve into those deeper psychological complexities that underlie some individual struggles with habit change.
Finally, how does Clear address those inevitable setbacks that we all experience? And how do we maintain our habits over the long term, especially when faced with things like boredom or discouragement?
So Clear emphasizes the importance of acknowledging when we slip up,
Okay,
but not allowing that to completely derail our progress.
right.
He uses a really helpful analogy. If your car gets a flat tire, you wouldn't slash the other three.
Right.
The key is to get back on track as quickly as possible after a misstep. He stresses that consistency over time is far more crucial than striving for absolute perfection.
So it's about embracing the occasional stumble and not letting it turn into a full-blown relapse.
Exactly. Clear also highlights that progress itself is a powerful form of motivation. Seeing tangible evidence of your improvement, even in small increments, fuels your desire to continue.
Yeah.
He also touches on the idea of finding the Goldilocks zone,
Okay.
engaging in tasks that are challenging enough to be engaging, but not so overwhelming that they lead to burnout.
Right.
And importantly, he cautions against boredom as a significant threat to maintaining habits over the long haul,
Interesting.
suggesting that it's important to find new ways to advance, to continually challenge yourself and keep the process interesting once you've reached a certain level of proficiency.
So it's like an ongoing process of refinement and adaptation rather than just setting and forgetting those habits.
Absolutely. Habits need to evolve as you grow and as your circumstances change. What works in one phase of your life might need to be adjusted in another.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into James Clear's Atomic Habits. To recap, the core principles here revolve around the power of those small, consistent improvements, the practical application of those 4 laws of behavior change, making good habits obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. That crucial shift in focus from just setting goals to building those sustainable systems,
Yes.
and then the fundamental role that our identity plays in driving that lasting change.
And it's important to remember that those seemingly insignificant daily habits, when compounded over time, have the potential to create really significant results,
Absolutely.
ultimately shaping who we become and what we are capable of achieving.
We've also explored some of those different perspectives on the book, acknowledging that while its principles have a really broad applicability,
Yeah.
individual experiences and circumstances can certainly influence how effectively they can be implemented. What resonates deeply with one person might present different challenges for another.
Yeah, exactly. It's a framework to consider, to experiment with and to adapt to our own unique context,
Yeah.
rather than a rigid one-size-fits-all solution.
So as you, our listener, take all of this in, I want you to consider just one small area of your life where a conscious effort to improve by just 1% each day, guided by these principles, could potentially lead to some surprising and significant long-term benefits.
Yes.
What's one tiny atomic habit that you might be willing to experiment with, starting perhaps even today? Something so small it almost feels trivial, but that could set you on a new and more positive trajectory? That's your food for thought. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.